Good morning. It's Reverend Mike Capron, the First Presbyterian Church of Troy, Pennsylvania. Hope you're well this morning, and we're continuing our series on the prophets. So I'm going to dive right in. About once a week, I have breakfast in Elmira with some other pastors, two Episcopalians, a Lutheran, and a Methodist. A few weeks ago, as I was leaving, I tried to go to the men's room. I pulled on the door, it was locked, and I assumed somebody was already in there. I figured I could make it to my next destination without peeing, so I started to leave. The waitress intercepted me and wondered if I knew the combination. I looked at her blankly. She took me back and pointed out the combination lock on the bathroom door, which I had overlooked. She entered the digits 1 through 8 on the lock, turned the knob, and opened the door. She explained that some homeless people had trashed their bathroom, so they had added the lock. Now, last week, I was in the Chautauqua Institution. Wonderful place. First-class lectures and arts and classes in a beautiful lakeside setting. I was on my way through the central square to go back to my room, and I found this jam session of gray-haired musicians playing folk songs. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. Um, anyway, I wanted to stay and listen to the music, but I had to pee. The cafe was nearby, and I wondered if I could get away with going to their bathroom without ordering any food. There was no lock on the door, and no one gave me any grief about it. Two men's rooms, two very different scenarios. Here's the difference. Downtown Elmira has poor people and homeless people. The Chautauqua Institution does not. It is not only a gated community, it's essentially a gated village. My badge to get me in for all these wonderful events came to about $100 a day. You know, near the end of his ministry, Jesus tells the disciples that you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. The comment about the poor is not his main point. It's an aside while talking about the woman who's just anointed him with expensive ointment. This line is delivered in Matthew, Mark, and John. The word John uses means the poor will always be in the same area as you, that you will be geographically co-located. The word from Matthew and Mark means that you will always be in some kind of relationship with poor people. Jesus is not merely saying that there will always be poor people. He is saying that his followers will see them and know them. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. In New Jersey, I noticed that towns were economically segregated. There were rich towns, which was most towns in northern and central Jersey because housing costs are insanely high. And there were poor towns and poor areas of cities. If you were in a poor town, you probably weren't welcome in a rich town. And racial profiling commingled with economic issues. This nice guy, Andy, had been the sexton of my wife's church in Verona for about 60 years. Verona was a mostly white and affluent town. Andy was a black man with a nice SUV and got pulled over by the police every now and again for doing nothing more than driving while black. So I give some credit to towns like Elmira and I think Troy for having more mixing of economic groups. Last week, we read about Micah chapter 6. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy and kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. It's easier to talk about that in the abstract than it is to live it out in community with others. The very nice waitress who showed me the combination lock on the bathrooms, she didn't know the name of the person who left their restroom in bad shape, and she probably didn't make the decision to put a lock on it. But she identified this unknown person or persons as part of a general category, homeless people. It's much easier to disregard someone's humanity if you can assign them to a general category. Homeless people, poor people, losers, bums, crazy, libs, ragheads, illegals, druggies. You get the idea. It's harder to disregard someone's humanity if you know their name, maybe their story, and you've had a civil conversation with them, maybe more than one. On Tuesday, I heard a news story that the federal authorities have taken over law enforcement in Washington have taken down some 40 homeless encampments. I'm not an expert on homelessness, but I try to meet people where they are. When I was in seminary trying to learn Greek and Hebrew, I got a dose of real life once a week when I went with a few other people to take lunch to homeless people in a big park in Atlanta, Georgia, and to study the Bible with them. There were some churches who took turns making the sandwiches. We had a half-hour Bible study with whoever gathered there and then ate with them. They were people. They had histories. Some of them had made some choices to be homeless, some had not. Ours was a fairly functional group, but there were probably a few with mental illness. They had lived different lives than I had. I remember getting into a conversation with one guy about high school. Somehow I mentioned that I hadn't personally known anyone who used drugs in my high school. His eyes got really big, and he exclaimed, "I didn't know anyone who didn't use drugs in my high school." I've often wondered how my life would have turned out differently if I'd grown up wearing the way he grew up. Anyway, dismantling homeless encampments. One of the things I learned all those years ago in Atlanta, Georgia is how screwed you are if you are homeless and your stuff gets stolen or lost. I mean, if I lose my wallet with my ID in it, I can drive home to where I have my birth certificate and social security card and go get a new driver's license. But if I was homeless and got my wallet stolen, I might have lost all my official documents all at once. And if I try to get new ones sent to me, especially from another state, what do I put down for my mailing address? I'm homeless. And homeless people are more likely to be victims of crime because they don't have a door they can lock to be safe while they sleep. And of course, if all their meager belongings get bulldozed, that's not good either. Now, I've been telling a lot of stories in this sermon. If there's a method to my madness, I might call this a bottom-up sermon, where I start with stories of people and work my way up toward God through the prophets. We've heard from Micah, but I'm really channeling Amos. He was a bottom-up kind of guy. Here's all we know about his call as a prophet from chapter 7. I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son. I am a herdsman, the dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. The first 3 chapters of Amos name crimes by foreign nations and domestic powers. He's an equal opportunity condemner of injustice. In God's name, he prophesies the punishment of all these nation groups. The list of their crimes is various, including things like cruelty and warfare, raiding peaceful communities, human trafficking, sexual immorality, denying justice in courts, and crushing the poor with heavy burdens. He does paint from a broad brush, but he names specific immoral behavior. He does not classify by coincidental conditions of life, like homelessness or race. Instead, he condemns not only individual evildoers, but the systems that condition behaviors and expectations. What do both well-off people and poor people expect will happen in society? Well, elites will expect that good things will come to them, and the poor will assume that their struggles will be severe. In his book, The Tiers of Things, Richard Rohr comments on these matters in a poignant way. Here's a long quote. Culture and systems are what create large-scale evils that threaten us, such as poverty, war, and ecological devastation. Religion must address collective evil. Nothing will ever change if we merely convert, imprison, or judge bad guys. That is why, though Jesus healed individuals, he simultaneously critiqued the systems that made them need healing. In fact, the best way to interpret most of his healing stories is to look at the whys. Why was a man chained in the cemetery in Luke 8? Why were women Jesus loved so often adulterers and prostitutes? John 8. Why was a woman with chronic bleeding? Why is she giving all her money to doctors? Mark 5. If you read these stories as only Jesus performing miraculous medical cures, you might think, wow, for 5 seconds. But when you ask why the healing was needed, you have a whole new way of seeing what needs to change, which is inevitably the bigger power structure, the institutionalized evils that sometimes don't look evil to us anymore, the structural sins. This concentration on the collective changes our moral focus entirely. If we do not recognize that evil first and foundationally resides in the group, we will continue to search out, condemn, or perhaps forgive the few bad apples, thinking that that will take care of our problems. But too often, sins we condemn as individual are admired, or at least given a cultural pass at the corporate level. Consider some of the contradictions of our own culture. For example, killing is wrong, but war is good. Greed is wrong, but luxury and capitalism are ideals to be sought after. Pride is bad, but nationalism and patriotism are admirable. Lust is wrong, but flirting and seduction are attractive. Envy is a capital sin, but advertising is our way of life. Anger at our neighbor is wrong, but angry people get their way. Sloth is a sin, but wealthy people can take it easy. Murder is wrong, but easy access to guns is a right and a duty. You can see how we got the sense, shared by many, that we are living in an utterly conflicted morality. Even capital sins such as greed and ambition are no longer critiqued at the individual level, but seen as virtues. So, the view from the bottom helps us to escape and even critique this human tendency. End quote. So I spent the first half of this sermon trying to evoke your compassion and sympathy for homeless people. Does that mean all homeless people are innocent victims? No. But there is an old phrase that Christians should remember. There, but for the grace of God, go I. It means I've been lucky enough not to wind up in dire straits myself, and I ought to be grateful to God for my good fortune. And it also means I shouldn't look down my nose at those who are less fortunate. It also means that from time to time I ought to pause and wonder what the systemic causes of things like homelessness are. Why don't we build enough houses? Why do home prices keep going up? Why is the zip code you are born in the number one predictor of your economic condition in life? You know, I usually quote biblical scholars and theologians, but let me quote an atheist I heard in a podcast recently. He asked, why do we have an economic system where capital flows to people who already have it and away from those people who have the least? It's a big question, an important question. But while you're doing that, and you should, don't get lost in the big questions and forget the people who are poor and needy right now, near to this place. So, what is Amos's positive vision? When you read the way he ends his prophecy and see that rewards and rejoicing are very much based in this earth and this world, and isn't that what a shepherd and a pruner of trees would understand? Well, here's some verses from chapter 9. Harvest will follow directly after plowing, and the treading of grapes immediately after sowing, when the mountains run with new wine, and the hills will flow with it. And God says, I mean to restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild their ruined cities and live in them, plant vineyards and drink their wine, dig gardens and eat their produce. I will plant them in their own country, never to be rooted up again out of the land that I have given them. I love the way that image is grounded in the land. Um, and it's not otherworldly, and it's not just abstract things like increased GDP. There's something tangible in his presentation of it. And then perhaps Amos 5:24 is his most famous and beloved verse. Let justice flow like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. I love this image of a stream nourishing the land, even as the land nourishes the people. God is like that, and God wants the church to be a part of God's nourishing ecosystem. So never forget that the prophets deliver God's word to God's people, and in this place and time, that is us. Amos was not just speaking all those centuries ago, he speaks to us in our place and time, conveying God's special concern for the poor and expecting us to respond as God's people. God bless, my friends. Amen.